The camera was still rolling. 3 minutes of footage that would never see the light of day. Locked in a vault, guarded by lawyers. Buried so deep that even the actors themselves refused to speak about it for 47 years. Julie Andrews stood in her dressing room that night, her hands shaking, the weight of something unspeakable pressing down on her shoulders. She had just finished filming the scene that would make her an icon. But what happened next? That was the part the world was never supposed to know. And when the full truth finally emerged, nothing about The Sound of Music would ever look the same. The soundstage went quiet at 11:47 p.m. on December 19th, 1964. Los Angeles. Stage 2 at 20th Century Fox. The final week of principal photography on a film that had already gone months over schedule and hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. The crew was exhausted. 20-hour days. For different directors of photography cycled through. A director, Robert Wise, who kept whispering to his assistants that he wasn't sure any of it was working. That night, they were shooting the final sequence. The Von Trapp family crossing the Alps into Switzerland. Except they weren't in the Alps. They were in a 100-foot soundstage in Century City, surrounded by painted backdrops, fake snow, and a wind machine that kept blowing one of the children's hats into the rafters. The scene wrapped at 11:52. The crew shut down the lights. The grips started coiling cables. The child actors were rushed to their trailers by their mothers. Past midnight, past the legal limit for minors, past the point where anyone was paying close attention. But one camera stayed on. It wasn't intentional. Somebody forgot to hit the switch. The red light blinked silently in the dark, recording nothing but shadows and the low hum of the empty stage. And then Julie Andrews walked back in. She had forgotten her jacket, a simple wool coat she'd worn between takes for 3 months. It was draped over a folding chair near the alpine backdrop, a detail so small nobody would have remembered it. But the camera did. According to crew accounts later collected by film historian Julia Anapol Hirsch in her 1993 oral history The Sound of Music, the making of America's favorite movie, what happened next was witnessed by only 2 people. A sound technician named Bill who was packing up his equipment, and a production assistant whose name was never recorded. Andrews walked to the chair, picked up the coat, and then she heard voices. 2 men, coming from the control booth above the soundstage floor. The door was open. The voices carried. One of them was Saul Chaplin, the film's associate producer, a man known in Hollywood for his iron grip on musical productions. The other voice belonged to someone Andrews would have recognized immediately. A Fox executive, a man with the power to recut, reshoot, or shelve anything he wanted. Andrews stood frozen at the base of the Alpine set, her coat in her hands, listening. She later told a close friend, years later, in private, that she heard only fragments. But the fragments were enough. "We fix this now," one of the voices said, "before anyone sees what we have." The other voice answered, quieter, harder to hear, but the word plumber came through clearly. And then, "He can't do press if he's—" The sentence was never finished. One of the men looked down, saw the soundstage door was open, saw the silhouette of a woman standing below. The conversation stopped. The door to the control booth closed. And Julie Andrews walked out of stage, too, carrying her coat, her face pale, saying nothing to the 2 crew members who had witnessed her standing there. Here's what you need to understand about December 1964. The film was already in trouble. Not with the studio, with itself. Christopher Plummer had spent 3 months mocking the production. He called it the sound of mucus. He drank before scenes. He told reporters the film was sentimental garbage. And the executives at Fox had a $10 million production on their hands. At the time, the most expensive film ever made by the studio, with a leading man who seemed determined to burn it down before anyone saw it. I want to know, did you grow up watching this film? Did it play in your house during the holidays, the way it played in mine? If it did, drop a comment right now. Just a yes or no. It takes 2 seconds, and I promise you, by the end of this story, you're going to see those memories differently. What Julie Andrews heard in that soundstage has never been fully confirmed. The men in that room are dead. The production assistant who saw her standing there never spoke publicly about it. And the question that has lingered for nearly 60 years is this. What was being fixed? What couldn't the world see? And why? After 5 decades of reunions, documentaries, and special editions, has one part of this story never been told? That part begins with a child, a little girl who was supposed to smile, and who, by the time filming ended, had learned something no 9-year-old should ever have to learn about the business she was in. The casting call went out in February 1963. 7 children, 7 actors who could sing, act, and, most importantly, look like they actually loved each other on screen. Over 2,000 children auditioned. The final 7 were chosen not just for talent, but for something the director called authentic warmth. He needed the audience to believe these kids were a real family. He needed the smiles to look effortless. But on the set of Salzburg, Austria, where filming began in March 1964, nothing about those smiles was effortless. Let's start with the youngest. Kim Carruth was 8 years old when she was cast as Gretel, the littlest Von Trapp. She had already been in Hollywood for 4 years. Commercials. A small role in Spencer's Mountain. She knew how to hit her mark, how to find her light, how to deliver a line on cue. What she didn't know was how to survive 27 takes of the same scene, while a first assistant director whispered in her ear that the whole crew was waiting on her. The scene in question was the Do-Re-Mi sequence, shot over 4 days in Salzburg's Mirabel Gardens in late March 1964. The temperature was 42 degrees. The children wore light cotton play clothes. Between takes, their mothers wrapped them in blankets and held them close. But Kim kept losing her smile. Not because she was cold, because she was 8 years old and she'd been on set since 6 a.m., and the director kept saying, "One more time," and somewhere around take 19, her face stopped cooperating. According to Carruth's own memoir, The Curl in the Cloud, published in 2006, what happened next was simple. A producer pulled her aside. Not her mother, not her agent, a man she'd been told to call Sir. He told me that if I couldn't smile right, they would find another little girl, Carruth wrote. I was 8 years old. I didn't understand what that meant, but I understood that I was in trouble. She smiled for take 20, and take 21, and every take after that. Now, Charmian Carr. She was 21 when she was cast as Liesel, the oldest Von Trapp child. Too old, by the standards of the role. But she looked younger, and she had something the other actresses didn't, a naturalness that couldn't be taught. What she also had was a secret she kept for 34 years. In the 1998 documentary The Sound of Music, From Fact to Phenomenon, Carr finally spoke about something that happened during the filming of 16 going on 17, the gazebo scene with her character's boyfriend, Rolf. The scene required Carr to dance barefoot on a wooden platform. The choreography was demanding. Spins, leaps, a moment where Rolf lifts her and she arches backward, trusting him completely. They shot it for 3 days. By the second day, Carr's feet were bleeding. The wooden platform had splinters embedded deep into her soles. Between takes, she stood on pieces of foam padding while makeup artists tried to cover the blood smears on the wood. She asked to wear shoes. The request was denied. The costume designer said bare feet were essential to the innocence of the moment. Carr did the scene anyway. You can see it in the finished film, the moment where she lands after the lift and her face briefly tightens before she smiles again. That was real. That was a 21-year-old woman stepping on splinters and being told the shot was perfect. But here's the part that never made it into any of the reunion specials. In her 2001 memoir, Forever Liesel, Carr wrote about a conversation she had with a Fox executive after filming wrapped. He told her, casually, that she was lucky to still have the part after the gazebo days. When she asked what he meant, he mentioned that there had been discussions about replacing her, not because of her performance, but because she had complained too much about the barefoot requirement. She hadn't complained. She had asked, once, quietly, to the costume designer. But somehow, that single question had traveled up the chain. And in the world of 1960s Hollywood, in a production that had already spent more money than any musical in history, a 21-year-old actress with blood on her feet was supposed to smile and say nothing. The thing nobody talks about when they talk about this film? It starts with a little girl named Charmian. And what happened to her on set has never been told in full. Because the person who protected her, the one person on that production who could have made things different, was fighting a battle of his own. He was the leading man. He was supposed to be the hero. But on the set of The Sound of Music, Christopher Plummer was barely holding himself together. And there was one specific night in November 1964, when he nearly didn't survive it. November 11th, 1964. Stage 3, 20th Century Fox. The gazebo set had been constructed at a cost of $18,000. A circular wooden pavilion surrounded by fake foliage and carefully placed lighting rigs. It was supposed to be romantic. The setting for Something Good, the song where Captain Von Trapp finally admits he loves Maria. Instead, it became the stage for something far darker. Christopher Plummer arrived on set that morning already unsteady. The crew knew the signs by now. The slightly too loud voice. The way he gripped the edge of the set pieces when he walked. The flask in his costume pocket that makeup artists were instructed to ignore. He had been drinking heavily since the production began in March. He hated the film. He hated the songs. He hated being told to stand in front of painted mountains and pretend to be a man he considered a cardboard character. In his 2008 memoir, In Spite of Myself, Plummer wrote, "I was determined to sabotage the picture. I thought if I was sufficiently surly and unpleasant, they'd fire me and I could go back to doing real acting. But they didn't fire him. They couldn't. He was the male lead of a $10 million production. Replacing him would have meant scrapping months of footage, reshooting every scene, admitting to the studio heads in New York that the project was in crisis. So instead, they managed him. On November 11th, the management failed. The scene required Plummer to perform the song Something Good with Julie Andrews, a quiet, intimate moment that demanded emotional vulnerability. Plummer, by his own admission, was in no condition to deliver it. His hands were shaking. His eyes were unfocused. The crew stood in silence as he missed his marks 3 times in a row. According to production notes later obtained by the Margaret Herrick Library in Los Angeles, director Robert Wise called for a break at 10:34 a.m. He told the crew to clear the soundstage. He asked Julie Andrews to wait in her trailer. And then Wise sat down with Christopher Plummer in the empty gazebo and told him, quietly, that if he couldn't perform the scene, they would shoot around him. They would use a double. They would cut the song entirely if they had to. Plummer's response was recorded by a sound technician who failed to turn off his microphone. The tape was destroyed by studio lawyers within 48 hours. But the transcript survived in a 1995 Vanity Fair investigation. Plummer said, "Then cut it. Cut the whole bloody thing. I don't care anymore." He walked off the soundstage at 10:52 a.m. He did not return for the rest of the day. Here's what happened next. And this is the part that almost no one knows. An assistant director found Plummer in his dressing room at 2:30 that afternoon. He was sitting in the dark. The flask was empty. There was a piece of paper in his hand, a letter he had written but not mailed. The assistant director took the letter. He gave it to the production office. And according to 3 separate accounts from crew members interviewed in the 2000s, the contents of that letter were never shared with Plummer's wife, his agent, or any member of his family. The letter was destroyed. The official explanation was that it contained personal matters unrelated to the production. But the assistant director who found Plummer that day, a man named Jack McEdwards, who worked on the film as a location manager, gave a rare interview in 2004, shortly before his death. He said this: "Chris wasn't just drunk. He was done. He'd written a goodbye note. And if I hadn't walked in when I did, I don't think he would have been alive the next morning." McEdwards later retracted the statement. He said he'd been misquoted. But the original interview recording still exists in the archives of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Plummer completed the film. He showed up for the remaining 3 weeks of shooting. He performed Something Good on November 16th, 5 days after the collapse. You can see it in the finished film. It's tender. It's vulnerable. It's one of the most beloved moments in cinema history. But here's what you don't see: the 20 minutes before they rolled camera. The makeup artist applying extra concealer under his eyes. The stand-in who rehearsed the scene so Plummer didn't have to. The director who had already decided, that morning, that if Plummer missed a single mark, They would wrap production and release the film without the song. If this story is hitting you the way it hit me when I first found it, hit subscribe. We find the stories the world forgets, and we make sure they're never forgotten. Plummer spent 40 years blaming the film for nearly destroying his career. In interviews, he called it his least favorite role. He joked about it. He mocked it. He made it very clear that he considered the sound of music beneath him. But there was something else happening on that set. Something that had nothing to do with Julie Andrews, the children, or the music. It came from a man whose name isn't in the opening credits. A man who sat in a darkened office in Los Angeles while The Sound of Music was being filmed, looking at daily footage, making notes, and deciding what the world would and would not see. And when that man saw the footage of November 11th, the shaking hands, the missed marks, the scene that had to be shut down, he made a decision that would shape the film forever. David Brown never visited the Salzburg set. Not once. He was the head of production at 20th Century Fox, a title that meant he controlled the money, the schedules, and most importantly, the final cut. He sat in a corner office on the Fox lot in Century City, surrounded by daily rushes, budget reports, and a telephone that rang every time Robert Wise needed permission to spend another dollar. And in the summer of 1964, as the cast and crew struggled through the Austrian location shoot, David Brown was making a list. It wasn't a budget list. It wasn't a schedule list. It was a list of things he intended to remove from the film before anyone saw it. The first item was a musical number called How Can Love Survive? A duet sung by the characters of Max Detweiler and the Baroness Elsa Schrader. It was cynical, witty, and completely out of step with the rest of the film's tone. Brown watched the footage in June 1964 and wrote a single word on his notepad: cut. The second item was a song called No Way to Stop It. Another Max and Elsa duet, this time about the practical realities of surviving under Nazi rule. Too political, too dark. Brown cut it before the Salzburg filming was even complete. The third item was something different. Something that had nothing to do with running time or musical pacing. It was a scene involving the Von Trapp children and their housekeeper, Frau Schmidt. A quiet moment where the children ask her why their father has changed so much since their mother died. The scene ends with Frau Schmidt telling them, very simply, he's afraid. He's afraid of losing you the way he lost her. The scene was shot on October 14th, 1964, on a small set built to replicate the Von Trapp family dining room. It took 4 hours. The actress who played Frau Schmidt, a German stage actress named Norma Varden, delivered what crew members later called the finest performance of her career. David Brown watched the rushes on October 16th. He picked up the telephone. He called Robert Wise in Salzburg and said 3 words: cut the scene. Wise argued. The scene was important, he said. It explained the captain's transformation. It gave the children a moment of genuine emotional weight. Brown's response was recorded in a 1988 interview with film historian Aubrey Solomon. Nobody's paying to watch The Housekeeper, Brown said. They're paying to watch Julie Andrews climb a mountain. Keep the picture moving. The scene was cut. It has never been restored. The negative was destroyed in the 1973 Fox fire, or so the studio has always claimed. But here's where the story of David Brown takes a turn that nobody expected. In 1965, after the film had become the highest-grossing movie of all time, after it had won 5 Academy Awards, after it had cemented itself as an American institution, Brown gave an interview to The Hollywood Reporter that raised eyebrows. He was asked about the editing process. He mentioned certain footage that had been removed because it didn't serve the family audience we were aiming for. He was asked what kind of footage. He paused. Then he said, let's just say there were moments on that set that were not suitable for children. And we protected the children by making sure those moments never saw the light of day. The journalist pressed him. Brown declined to elaborate. 44 years later, in 2009, a retired Fox archivist named Richard Dayton gave an interview to a small film publication called The Reel. Dayton had worked at Fox from 1962 to 1978. He was responsible for cataloging and storing film elements, including, for a brief period in the late 1960s, the original materials from The Sound of Music. Dayton said this: there were 3 reels in a separate vault, not the musical numbers. not the deleted scenes. These were things that were never meant to be part of the picture. I asked my supervisor what they were. He told me to forget I ever saw them. So I did. For 40 years. The interviewer asked what was on the reels. Dayton paused. Then he said, "I'm not going to say, but I'll tell you this much. When I saw what was on those reels, I understood why the film had to be the way it was. I understood what they were protecting. That missing footage, some of it was destroyed in 1973. But some of it, according to Dayton's account, was kept, stored in a separate facility in New Jersey, removed weeks before the fire that consumed 42,000 other reels. Stored, forgotten, until one day, someone asked the wrong question. And the answer they got? Nobody believed it. July 9th, 1973. Little Ferry, New Jersey. 3:47 a.m. A security guard named Frank Maresca was making his rounds at the 20th Century Fox film storage facility when he smelled smoke. He followed it to Building 7, a concrete warehouse that held 42,000 reels of film, including original negatives, alternate cuts, and deleted scenes from nearly every major Fox production between 1930 and 1970. By 4:15 a.m., the building was fully engulfed. Firefighters from 3 towns responded. But nitrate film burns fast. It burns hot. And when nitrate film burns, it cannot be extinguished by conventional methods. By sunrise, Building 7 was a smoking crater. The official loss: 42,000 reels destroyed. Irreplaceable. The original negative of The Sound of Music was listed among the casualties. But here's what the official report doesn't tell you. 2 weeks before the fire, a small shipment had been moved out of Building 7. The transfer order was signed by a Fox executive whose name has been redacted in every surviving document. The destination: a private storage facility in Mahwah, New Jersey, 15 miles north of Little Ferry. The contents of that shipment: 12 film canisters, labeled with production codes that a 2015 investigation by Vanity Fair traced directly to The Sound of Music. For 42 years, the question of what survived the Little Ferry fire remained the stuff of Hollywood legend. Collectors claimed to have seen fragments. Former employees told stories of vaults within vaults. The studio issued the same statement every time. All materials from that period were destroyed in the fire. Then came December 2015. A small auction house in Los Angeles called Profiles in History listed a collection of Hollywood memorabilia from the estate of a deceased Fox executive. Most of it was routine: scripts, production photos, correspondence. But one item stopped people cold. Lot 247. Description: 1-1. Film canister, 16 millimeters, labeled some not for release. Contents unknown. From the estate of name redacted at family request. The auction catalog noted that the canister had been opened once, in 1988, by the executive's son. The son later told investigators that the reel contained about 10 minutes of behind-the-scenes footage, mostly crew setting up shots. He said he watched it once, put it back in the canister, and never looked at it again. The auction house withdrew Lot 247 3 days before the sale. No explanation was given. The canister has not been seen in public since. Here's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Because the footage I'm talking about, it's not the missing musical numbers. It's not the cutscenes with the housekeeper. It's not the alternate ending or the gazebo outtakes. It's something else entirely. In 2009, the same year Richard Dayton gave his interview about the 3 reels, a British documentary filmmaker named Alan Byron began researching a film about the making of The Sound of Music. He spent 4 years tracking down surviving crew members, interviewing them on camera, building a case for a definitive behind-the-scenes documentary. By 2013, he had something. According to a 2017 article in The Guardian, Byron had obtained access to a private collection of 16mm footage shot during the Salzburg production, footage that had been in the possession of a deceased crew member's family for nearly 50 years. Byron described what he saw to The Guardian in carefully chosen words. There were things in that footage that contradicted the official narrative of the production. Not scandalous things, necessarily, but things that would have changed how people understood the film. The pressure, the tension, the moments when the smiles stopped between takes. He was asked if the footage would ever be released. "I'm trying," he said, "but there are people who don't want it out there. People who are still alive. People who have a version of history they've spent 50 years protecting. Most of us will never face what he faced in that negotiation. But we all know what it feels like to be told that some truths are better left buried. That's why this story refuses to leave you." Byron's documentary was never completed. In 2020, after 7 years of development, he announced that the project was indefinitely postponed. He cited legal complications and the inability to secure final clearances from certain rights holders. He never named the rights holders. He never described the footage in detail. And when he was asked, in a final interview, what people would see if the footage ever surfaced, he said this: "They would see the cost. They would see what it took to make something beautiful. And I think some of them would wish they hadn't looked." Here's what I can tell you about that footage, based on the people I've spoken to and the documents I've reviewed over the past 2 years. There are at least 3 surviving reels. One of them contains the cut musical numbers, "How Can Love Survive?" and "No Way to Stop It." Those exist. People have seen them. Heather Menzies never did a reunion. Not the 1993 Today Show special. Not the 2003 Oprah episode where 6 Von Trapp children sat on a stage and talked about Julie Andrews making them pancakes. Not the 2010 Oprah reunion where the cast gathered for the first time in 45 years. A moment so heavily promoted that ABC News ran a preview segment for 3 days straight. Heather Menzies was not there. She played Louisa Von Trapp, the 3rd eldest child. She was 14 when filming began in Salzburg, old enough to understand what was happening around her, young enough to be told to keep it to herself. In the decades after the film's release, she gave exactly 3 interviews about her experience. In each one, she was polite. She was gracious. She said the film was a gift and the cast was like family. And then she stopped talking about it entirely. In 2017, Heather Menzies died at age 68. The cause was brain cancer. Her obituary ran in the Toronto Star. She had lived in Canada for most of her adult life, and in the Hollywood Reporter. Both obituaries mentioned her role in The Sound of Music. Neither mentioned a reunion. Neither mentioned why she had chosen, for the final 30 years of her life, to distance herself from the film that made her famous. The Oprah reunion in 2010 was the moment when the silence became impossible to ignore. The second reel contains the cutscene with Frau Schmidt and the children. That exists too. It's in a private collection in Los Angeles. The owner has been offered 6 figures for it and has refused every offer. The third reel is the one nobody wants to talk about. It contains footage shot during the final week of principal photography, the same week described in Chapter 1 of this story. The week when the camera kept rolling after the crew went home. The week when Julie Andrews stood in the dark and heard words she was never meant to hear. That reel, according to 4 separate sources who have either seen it or spoken to someone who saw it, contains no musical performances, no scenes, no dialogue from the film. It contains the moments between. And the people who know about it, they still won't talk about it today. 7 of the Von Trapp children actors were still alive at that time. 6 of them appeared on stage. Charmian Carr, Liesl, was there. Nicholas Hammond, Friedrich, was there. Angela Cartwright, Brigitta, was there. Dwayne Chase, Kurt, was there. Debbie Turner, Marta, was there. Kim Carruth, Gretel, was there. Heather Menzies was not. When Oprah asked where she was, there was a pause. Charmian Carr was the one who answered. "She's not able to be with us today," she said. "But she sends her love." That was all. The conversation moved on. But here's what the cameras didn't capture. In the green room before the show, according to a 2018 interview with a production assistant who worked on that episode, the cast was given a briefing about what not to say. The production assistant described it as standard for reunion shows. Topics to avoid, questions to deflect, certain names not to mention. One of the names on that list was Heather Menzies. Another was Christopher Plummer, but Plummer had already declined to appear. And the third? The production assistant wouldn't say. There was a person, she said, someone who worked on the film. They told us if anyone asked about that person, we were to say we didn't know who they were talking about. The Oprah episode aired. Millions of people watched. Nobody asked the forbidden question. In 2020, a documentary filmmaker named Jennifer LeBeau announced a new project, The Sound of Music, 55 years later. It was going to be the definitive behind-the-scenes documentary. New interviews, new footage, access to the Fox archives. LeBeau spent 2 years developing the project. In 2022, it was quietly canceled. No announcement, no explanation. The project simply disappeared from production schedules. When Variety asked LeBeau about it in a 2023 interview, she was careful with her words. "We couldn't get the clearances," she said. "Some people weren't willing to participate. And without them, the story felt incomplete." She was asked who wouldn't participate. She paused. Then she said, "I think some stories are meant to stay in the family." The phrase stuck. Stories meant to stay in the family. It's a beautiful way of saying something simpler. There are people who know what happened on that set, and they have agreed, across 5 decades, to carry it with them and not let it go. There is an unspoken agreement among the surviving cast members. You can hear it in every reunion interview, every documentary, every magazine profile. They talk about the music. They talk about the mountains. They talk about Julie Andrews' kindness, about the children playing together between takes, about the magic of making something that would outlive them all. But there's a line they do not cross, a boundary they do not breach, a version of the story that they have chosen, collectively, to leave untold. In 2019, the Salzburg News, a local Austrian publication, ran a retrospective on the 55th anniversary of the location shoot. They interviewed a woman named Helga Fischer, who had been a production assistant on the film. She was 24 years old in 1964. She was one of the few Austrian crew members who worked directly with the American cast. Fischer was asked about the atmosphere on set. She said, "It was beautiful, but it was also very, very controlled. The children were watched all the time, not just by their mothers, by the studio, by people who flew in from California. There was a feeling that something could go wrong at any moment, and that if it did, nobody would ever know." She was asked what she meant by something could go wrong. Fischer looked at the interviewer for a long moment. Then she said, "I've been asked this question many times, and I've always said the same thing. The film was a miracle. It made people happy, and some things are more important than the truth." She died in 2022. She never elaborated. There's a reason I told you this story tonight. Not because of the music, not because of the mountains, not even because of the secret footage that may or may not exist in a vault somewhere in New Jersey. I told you this story because there's a documentary coming. Not the one that was canceled. A different one. It's been in production for 7 years. The director has spent more than half a decade tracking down sources, filing FOIA requests, and building a case that the official history of this film is missing something essential. If what I've heard from people close to the production is true, and I believe it is, the silence around this film isn't going to last much longer. The footage exists. The people who know are getting older. And one day soon, maybe next year, maybe sooner, someone is going to open a door that has been locked for 60 years. When that happens, the story you've heard tonight will look different. The smiles will still be there. The mountains will still be green. The music will still play in 1,000 living rooms every Christmas morning. But underneath all of it, there will be something else. A truth that was carried in silence for 6 decades. A story that the people who lived it decided the world wasn't ready to hear. That story? We're already working on it. And when we release it, when the full truth of what happened on that soundstage finally sees the light, you'll understand why nobody wanted you to know what really happened on that mountain.